What if I told you that America's oldest car company, older than Ford, older than Chevrolet, was deliberately killed off by the very corporation that owned it? Not because it was failing, not because it couldn't compete, but because internal politics and corporate spreadsheets decided that 107 years of automotive innovation had to die. Picture this. It's 1976, and you're standing in an Oldsmobile dealership. The Cutlass Supreme is the best-selling car in America. Not just the best-selling Oldsmobile, the best-selling car, period. More Americans are buying Cutlasses than Camaros, Mustangs, or Accords. The parking lot is packed. The sales team can barely keep up with demand. Oldsmobile is printing money for General Motors, contributing nearly $1 billion in profit annually. That's about $4.5 billion in today's money, from a single division. Fast forward just 28 years, April 29, 2004. The last Oldsmobile rolls off the assembly line in Lansing, Michigan. It's a dark cherry metallic Alero, destined for a museum, not a customer. The workers who built it signed their names under the hood. Many of them were crying. Their fathers had built Oldsmobiles, their grandfathers had built Oldsmobiles. Now they were building a coffin for an American icon. This is the story of how General Motors murdered its own golden goose. How a brand that pioneered the automatic transmission, introduced the first mass-produced V8 engine, and created the muscle car blueprint was systematically dismantled by corporate incompetence, brand confusion, and the most expensive mistake in automotive history. A mistake that cost GM not just billions of dollars, but something far more valuable, its soul. To understand the tragedy, we need to travel back to August 21st, 1897. Lansing, Michigan. A 33-year-old entrepreneur named Ransom Eli Olds has just test-driven his first gasoline-powered automobile. While Henry Ford is still tinkering in his Detroit workshop, he won't found his company for another 6 years. Olds is already thinking about mass production. He sees something others don't. Automobiles shouldn't be toys for the rich. They should be transportation for everyone. By 1901, Olds had done something revolutionary. He created the first assembly line production system, yes, before Henry Ford. His curved-dash Oldsmobile was the world's first mass-produced automobile. The little car weighed just 850 pounds, produced 5 horsepower from its single-cylinder engine, and could hit a blazing 20 miles per hour. Doesn't sound like much? Consider this. Olds was producing 425 units in 1901. By 1904, he was building 5,000 cars annually. Nobody else on Earth was manufacturing automobiles at that scale. The Curve Dash cost $650, about $22,000 in today's money. A comparable automobile from European manufacturers cost 5 times that amount. Olds had cracked the code. He proved that automobiles could be affordable, reliable, and profitable. General Motors took notice. In 1908, William Durant was building his automotive empire. He'd already acquired Buick and was hungry for more. Oldsmobile was the crown jewel, an established brand with revolutionary manufacturing techniques and a loyal customer base. Durant bought Oldsmobile for $3 million. Adjusted for inflation? That's about $95 million today. Within a decade, Oldsmobile would be generating that much profit every single year. But here's where Oldsmobile's DNA was truly forged. Durant positioned it strategically within GM's hierarchy. Chevrolet would be the entry-level brand. Pontiac would offer a bit more style. Oldsmobile would provide innovation and technology at a premium, but not luxury, price point. Buick would cater to successful professionals. Cadillac would compete with the world's finest automobiles. This latter, what GM called a car for every purse and purpose, was genius. A young family might start with a Chevrolet, move up to a Pontiac, graduate to an Oldsmobile, achieve success with a Buick, and crown their achievements with a Cadillac. Each step up the ladder kept customers within the GM family. Oldsmobile sat perfectly in the middle, the sweet spot where aspiration met affordability, and Oldsmobile earned that position through innovation. Let me paint you a picture of just how revolutionary this brand was. In 1940, Oldsmobile introduced the Hydra-matic transmission, the world's first fully automatic transmission offered in mass production. Think about that. Every automatic transmission in every car today traces its lineage back to Oldsmobile's innovation. Before Hydra-matic, you shifted gears manually or you didn't drive. Oldsmobile changed that forever. The Hydra-matic wasn't just successful, it was a phenomenon. By 1941, 30% of Oldsmobile buyers were choosing the automatic option, despite it costing an extra $100, about $2,000 today. General Motors licensed the technology to other manufacturers. Rolls-Royce used it. Bentley used it. Even bitter rival Ford eventually caved and licensed Hydra-matic technology. During World War II, Oldsmobile's automatic transmission technology was adapted for tanks. The M5 Stuart and M24 Chaffee light tanks used Hydra-matic transmissions, giving American armor unprecedented reliability and ease of operation. But Oldsmobile's greatest moment was yet to come. The year was 1949. Oldsmobile's chief engineer, Gilbert Burrell, had been working on something special. GM's head of research, Charles Kettering, had challenged him to create an engine with higher compression ratios. The conventional wisdom said you couldn't go much above 7.1 compression without causing devastating engine knock. Burrell's team developed something radical, an overhead valve V8 with a compression ratio of 7.5.1, the Rocket V8. Just the name tells you everything. This wasn't just an engine, it was propulsion. The 303 cubic inch power plant generated 135 horsepower and 283 pound-feet of torque. In 1949, most V8s were lucky to produce 100 horsepower. The Rocket V8 was 35% more powerful than anything in its class. But raw power was only part of the story. The Rocket V8 was over-square. Its bore was larger than its stroke. This meant it could rev higher and breathe better than traditional undersquare engines. It used hydraulic valve lifters, eliminating the need for periodic valve adjustments. The short-stroke design reduced piston speed, increasing longevity. This engine wasn't just powerful, it was sophisticated, reliable, and smooth. Oldsmobile dropped this atomic bomb of an engine into their relatively lightweight '88 model. The result? The world's first muscle car. No, not the 1964 Pontiac GTO. The 1949 Oldsmobile Rocket 88 invented the formula. Take a powerful engine from your bigger cars, stuff it into your smaller, lighter model, and let physics handle the rest. The Rocket 88 dominated NASCAR's early years. In 1949, Oldsmobile won 6 of the 8 races. In 1950, they won 10 of 19. In 1951, they took 20 of 41 races. Red Byron, NASCAR's first champion, wheeled an Oldsmobile. So did Lee Petty, Richard Petty's father. The Beach Boys didn't sing about Ford or Chevy, they sang about Rocket 88. Ike Turner's Rocket 88, recorded in 1951, is often credited as the first rock and roll song. The car literally inspired a musical revolution. By 1972, Oldsmobile had become GM's third best-selling division, trailing only Chevrolet and Pontiac. But it was the Cutlass that would elevate Oldsmobile to its zenith. The Cutlass nameplate, introduced in 1961, had evolved from a compact experiment to a personal luxury coupe that perfectly captured the American zeitgeist. The fourth-generation Cutlass, introduced in 1973, was a masterpiece of market positioning. It offered Monte Carlo style at a Chevelle price. The Supreme model added luxury touches, plusher seats, upgraded interior materials, opera windows that made buyers feel like they were getting Buick quality at Oldsmobile prices. The formal roofline, inspired by more expensive luxury cars, gave it presence. The availability of every engine from an economical 231 cubic inch V6 to the thundering 455 rocket V8 meant there was a Cutlass for everyone. In 1976, Oldsmobile achieved the impossible. The Cutlass Supreme became America's best-selling car with 496,351 units sold. Let that sink in. Nearly 500,000 Americans chose an Oldsmobile, not a Chevrolet Impala, not a Ford LTD, an Oldsmobile. The brand was so hot that dealers were taking bribes for allocation. Customers were waiting months for delivery. Some dealers were charging $500 over sticker, about $2,500 today, and buyers were gladly paying it. The numbers from this era are staggering. In 1977, Oldsmobile sold 530,459 Cutlasses. In 1978, 520,279. In 1979, 518th and 163. For 4 consecutive years, Oldsmobile moved over 500,000 units of a single nameplate. The Cutlass alone was outselling entire brands. It beat every Toyota model combined. It outsold all of Chrysler. Corporations' intermediates put together. 1 in every 20 cars on American roads was a Cutlass. But success breeds complacency. And at General Motors, it bred something worse, jealousy. Other divisions watched Oldsmobile's success with envious eyes. Chevrolet executives complained that Oldsmobile was stealing their customers. Buick argued that Oldsmobile was encroaching on their territory. Pontiac felt squeezed from below. Even Cadillac worried about loaded Cutlass Supremes approaching their price points. GM's response to this internal strife would prove catastrophic. Instead of celebrating Oldsmobile's success, corporate leadership decided to share the wealth. They began a process called platform sharing that would ultimately destroy everything that made each brand unique. The idea seemed logical on a spreadsheet. If all divisions shared basic components, costs would plummet and profits would soar. The 1978 G-Body platform exemplified this new philosophy. The Cutlass Supreme, Buick Regal, Pontiac Grand Prix, and Chevrolet Monte Carlo were now essentially the same car with different grilles and taillights. Sure, Oldsmobile still had unique engines and some distinct styling cues, but the fundamental architecture was identical. An accountant's dream, a brand manager's nightmare. Then came May 1977, the scandal that would forever taint Oldsmobile's reputation. Joseph Sywek, a Chicago taxi driver, discovered his new Delta 88 didn't have a rocket V8. It had a Chevrolet 350. Same displacement, completely different engine. Sywek sued. He'd paid for an Oldsmobile with Oldsmobile's legendary rocket power, and GM had given him a Chevrolet engine instead. The lawsuit revealed something shocking. GM had installed Chevrolet engines in 128,000 Oldsmobiles without telling anyone, not the dealers, not the customers, nobody. When questioned, GM executives seemed genuinely puzzled by the outrage. To them, an engine was an engine. They'd completely lost touch with what made their brand special. The settlement cost GM $40 million in 1977 dollars, about $200 million today. But the real cost was immeasurable. Oldsmobile's reputation for engineering excellence was shattered. The phrase, "It's not your father's Oldsmobile," which would later become an advertising slogan, started as a bitter customer complaint. Your father's Oldsmobile had a rocket V8. Yours had whatever GM had lying around. The 1980s brought more challenges. The oil crises had shifted consumer preferences towards smaller, more efficient vehicles. Oldsmobile responded with the Forenza, a rebadged Chevrolet Cavalier that insulted the intelligence of anyone who'd ever loved the brand. They offered the Omega, which was literally a Chevrolet Citation with different badges. The Sierra, while successful, was kept in production so long it became a rolling anachronism. But nothing compared to the diesel disaster. In 1978, Oldsmobile introduced a diesel version of its 350 V8. GM's engineers, trying to meet fuel economy standards, had converted a gasoline engine to diesel, rather than designing a purpose-built diesel from scratch. This saved development costs. It also created one of the worst engines in automotive history. The Oldsmobile diesel was an engineering catastrophe. The block wasn't strong enough for diesel's higher compression ratios, 22.1, versus the gasoline engine's 8.1. Head bolts stretched and snapped. Head gaskets failed with religious consistency. The fuel injection system, supplied by Rusa Master, couldn't maintain proper timing. Camshafts wore flat. Main bearings spun. By 50,000 miles, most of these engines were dead. The head bolt problem was particularly egregious. Diesel combustion pressures reached 800 psi, nearly double what the gasoline engine experienced. GM used the same head bolts from the gas engine, just with a slightly different torque specification. They stretched like taffy. When they failed, coolant mixed with oil, creating a chocolate milkshake of death for the engine's bearings. GM sold 350,000 of these diesel bombs between 1978 and 1985. The warranty claims were astronomical. Class action lawsuits piled up. GM eventually offered to buy back diesel-equipped cars or swap in gasoline engines at no charge. The total cost? Industry analysts estimated nearly $1 billion in 1980s money, about $3 billion today. The diesel debacle didn't just hurt Oldsmobile, it poisoned American consumers against diesel passenger cars for a generation. In 1981, diesels represented 6% of the U.S. car market. By 1985, that had fallen to less than 1%. Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and Peugeot, companies that actually knew how to build diesel engines, saw their diesel sales evaporate. Americans associated diesel with Oldsmobile's failure. By the late 1980s, Oldsmobile was in full identity crisis. GM's response? The most tone-deaf advertising campaign in automotive history. "This is not your father's Oldsmobile," launched in 1988. Think about that message for a second. Oldsmobile was literally telling customers that their heritage, the very thing that built brand loyalty, was something to run away from. The commercials featured celebrities like William Shatner and Ringo Starr with their real-life children, driving new Oldsmobiles and proclaiming them nothing like the old ones. The problem? Your father's Oldsmobile was when the brand meant something. Your father's Oldsmobile had a rocket V8, Hydra-matic transmission, and legitimate innovation. This new Oldsmobile? It was a confused mishmash of rebadged Chevrolets and half-hearted attempts at relevance. But even as corporate incompetence strangled the brand, Oldsmobile engineers kept fighting. In 1988, they introduced the Quad 4 engine. This 2.3-liter dual overhead cam four-cylinder was genuinely revolutionary. It produced 150 horsepower in standard trim, an outstanding 65 horsepower per liter. The high-output version generated 180 horsepower. Some experimental versions reached 190 horsepower, 83 horsepower per liter, naturally aspirated. In 1990, the Quad 4 featured chain-driven dual overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, and sophisticated port fuel injection. It could rev to 7,000 RPM safely. The W41 performance version, available in the Cutlass Calais 442, made 190 horsepower and 160 pound-feet of torque from just 138 cubic inches. It would embarrass V6s twice its size. In 1995, Oldsmobile shocked everyone with the Aurora. This wasn't a rebadged anything. It was a purpose-built luxury sedan designed to compete with BMW and Mercedes-Benz. The Aurora's 4.0-liter DOHC V8, derived from Cadillac's North Star but unique to Oldsmobile, produced 250 horsepower and 260 pound-feet of torque. The engine was a jewel, smooth, refined, and powerful. The Aurora's styling was revolutionary for GM. No chrome, no fake wood, no vinyl roof. Just clean, aerodynamic lines that looked like they belonged in Stuttgart, not Detroit. The interior featured real aluminum trim, leather seats, and a driver-focused cockpit. The chassis used GM's G-body platform, but with Oldsmobile-specific tuning that delivered surprisingly athletic handling. Automotive journalists were stunned. Car and Driver called it GM's best effort in decades. Motor Trend praised its refinement and performance. Sales started strong, 44,000 units in 1995. Customers who bought Auroras loved them. Owner satisfaction scores rivaled Lexus. It seemed like Oldsmobile had found its path back to relevance. But GM had already signed Oldsmobile's death warrant. Inside the Renaissance Center, GM's fortress-like headquarters in Detroit, executives were looking at spreadsheets, not products. Oldsmobile's sales had fallen from over 1 million units annually in the mid-1980s to just 289,000 in 1998. The brand's average buyer was 61 years old and getting older every year. Younger buyers didn't even consider Oldsmobile. To them, it was their grandfather's brand. The numbers were brutal. GM was spending approximately $3 billion annually to keep Oldsmobile alive. Development costs, marketing, dealer support. The return on investment was negative. Every Oldsmobile sold actually cost GM money when you factored in overhead. Meanwhile, GM's truck divisions were printing money. The accountants had an easy answer: kill Oldsmobile, redirect resources to more profitable ventures. On December 12, 2000, GM CEO Rick Wagoner made the announcement. Oldsmobile would be phased out over the next few years. The oldest surviving American automobile brand, 107 years of history, would cease to exist. The decision stunned employees, devastated dealers, and confused customers. How could GM kill a brand that had just introduced the innovative Bravada SUV, the stylish Alero sedan, and still had the Aurora? The phase-out was a case study in how not to kill a brand. GM promised dealers they'd be taken care of. They offered buyouts averaging $850,000 per dealership. Sounds generous? Consider that many dealers had just invested millions in GM-mandated facility upgrades. They'd ordered inventory based on GM's assurances that Oldsmobile had a future. Now they were being told to liquidate. The legal battles were vicious. Dealers sued for breach of contract, fraud, and unfair business practices. GM eventually paid out over $1 billion in settlements, but even that number understates the true cost. Oldsmobile dealers didn't just sell Oldsmobiles, they sold GMCs, Chevrolets, Buicks, and Cadillacs. When Oldsmobile died, many dealers dropped GM entirely. They picked up Toyota, Honda, and Nissan franchises instead. GM didn't just lose Oldsmobile sales, they lost entire dealerships. The human cost was devastating. Lansing, Michigan, Oldsmobile's birthplace and primary manufacturing center, lost thousands of jobs. The Lansing car assembly plant, which had built Oldsmobiles since 1901, faced closure. Workers who'd spent their entire careers building Oldsmobiles were told their skills were no longer needed. Some committed suicide. Others never found comparable employment again. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The real tragedy was what Oldsmobile's death represented. This wasn't market forces claiming an obsolete brand. This was corporate suicide. GM killed Oldsmobile not because it couldn't be saved, but because saving it required vision, investment, and patience, three things GM's leadership utterly lacked. Consider what Oldsmobile could have been. In 2000, the premium car market was exploding. BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Audi were growing 10 to 15% annually. Lexus had proven Americans would pay premium prices for quality and technology. Oldsmobile had the heritage, the engineering capability, and the dealer network to compete. The Aurora proved they could build world-class cars. They just needed corporate support and consistent messaging. Instead, GM spent the $2 billion it cost to kill Oldsmobile. That's not a typo. Between dealer buyouts, legal settlements, employee severance, and shutdown costs, GM spent $2 billion to eliminate a brand that had generated over $100 billion in revenue during its lifetime. They could have used that money to develop 3 all-new vehicle platforms. They could have created a hybrid powertrain years before the Prius made them look foolish. They could have made Oldsmobile GM's technology showcase Tesla before Tesla. The market timing couldn't have been worse. GM killed Oldsmobile just as crossovers were about to explode. The Bravada, Oldsmobile's SUV, was actually excellent, a sophisticated alternative to truck-based SUVs. With proper development, it could have competed with the Lexus RX, BMW X5, and Mercedes ML. Instead, GM killed it just as the market was taking off. Let's talk about what actually died with Oldsmobile. The Rocket V8 lineage, gone. The Quad-4 engine family, killed. The Aurora's sophisticated chassis, abandoned. The engineering talent that created these innovations, scattered to the winds. Some went to competitors. Others left the industry entirely. GM didn't just lose a brand. They lost institutional knowledge that took a century to accumulate. The ripple effects continue today. GM's current struggles with brand identity trace directly back to Oldsmobile's death. Without Oldsmobile as the technology bridge between Chevrolet and Buick, GM's brand ladder collapsed. Pontiac tried to fill the gap and failed. GM killed it in 2009. Saturn, GM's other attempt at creating an innovative brand, died the same year. Buick only survived because of China, where it inexplicably remains popular. The dealers GM lost when Oldsmobile died, they're now some of the most successful Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai dealers in America. They took their customer relationships, their market knowledge, and their anger at GM straight to the competition. Every Camry sold by an ex-Oldsmobile dealer is a reminder of GM's short-sightedness. But the greatest loss was trust. GM told Oldsmobile customers their brand would be supported through the phase-out. They lied. Parts became scarce. Warranty claims were disputed. Resale values plummeted. An entire generation of loyal GM customers felt betrayed. They didn't just stop buying Oldsmobiles. They stopped buying GM products entirely. The financial analysts who pushed for Oldsmobile's death claimed it would save GM money. Did it? In 2001, GM's market share was 28.3%. By 2008, it had fallen to 22.6%. That 5-point drop represents about 950,000 units annually. If even a third of those losses were former Oldsmobile buyers who abandoned GM, that's over 300,000 sales lost every year. At an average transaction price of $30,000 and a 10% profit margin, that's $900 million in lost profit annually. The brand has been dead for 20 years. Do the math. The engineers who created the Rocket V8 would weep at what GM has become. Oldsmobile pioneered turbocharging in the 1962 Jetfire. They created the first modern muscle car. They introduced America to automatic transmissions. They pushed boundaries, took risks, and built things that mattered. Their DNA should be in every GM product. Instead, it's buried in a corporate graveyard, marked only by a stone that reads 1897-2004. I've talked to former Oldsmobile engineers for this story, men and women who devoted their careers to building better cars. They don't talk about market share or profit margins. They talk about the Quad-4 engine that could have evolved into a world beater. They describe Aurora successors that never got built. They mention advanced hybrid systems that were killed in development. These weren't dreamers. These were serious engineers with serious plans that died with their division. One engineer who asked not to be named told me about a project from 1999. Oldsmobile was developing a direct-injection turbocharged V6 that would have produced 350 horsepower from just 3.0 liters. This was years before Ford's EcoBoost, years before everyone went turbo. The engine existed. It ran. It was brilliant. When Oldsmobile died, the project died with it. That engineer now works for Tesla. The Aurora alone proves what Oldsmobile could have been. Owners' forums still exist, 2 decades after production ended. These aren't collectors preserving classics. There are people daily driving 25-year-old cars because nothing GM builds today matches what Oldsmobile built then. The Aurora's North Star-derived V8 regularly runs past 200,000 miles with basic maintenance. The chassis still feels contemporary. The styling has aged better than most cars from the 2000s. GM's current CEO, Mary Barra, has admitted killing Oldsmobile was a mistake. Too little, too late. You can't resurrect a century of engineering culture. You can't rebuild dealer relationships you destroyed. You can't recapture customers you betrayed. Oldsmobile is dead, and with it died GM's last connection to innovative risk-taking. The tragedy extends beyond business metrics. Oldsmobile represented something essentially American, the belief that engineering excellence could be democratic. You didn't need to be rich to own sophisticated technology. The Rocket V8 wasn't reserved for Cadillacs. The Hydra-Matic wasn't a luxury-only option. Oldsmobile made innovation accessible. They democratized performance. Today's GM would never create an Oldsmobile. Too risky, too expensive, too hard to explain to shareholders. Modern GM builds Silverados and Tahoes, profitable but boring trucks that require zero imagination. They're abandoning sedans entirely, ceding that market to competitors. They're chasing quarterly earnings instead of building lasting value. Ransom Eli Olds would be appalled. The last Oldsmobile ever built sits in the R.E. Olds Transportation Museum in Lansing, that dark cherry metallic Alero, signed by the workers who built it. It's not a particularly special car. The Alero was competent but uninspiring, a perfect metaphor for what Oldsmobile had become under GM's mismanagement. But those signatures under the hood, they represent something profound. They're the last testament of craftsmen who built rockets. I visited that museum while researching this story. The early Oldsmobiles are magnificent, brass and wood and leather, built when automobiles were still miraculous. The Rocket 88s look ready to race. The 442s radiate menace. The Toronados showcase impossible engineering. And then you reach the final room with that last Alero, and it's heartbreaking. It's like watching a thoroughbred die in a glue factory. The museum's curator told me something interesting. The Alero still runs. They start it once a month, let it idle for 20 minutes, then shut it down. It's got 7 miles on the odometer, the distance from the end of the assembly line to the transport truck. Those 7 miles represent Oldsmobile's funeral procession. GM learned nothing from Oldsmobile's death. They killed Pontiac 5 years later using the same playbook: dealer, buyouts, broken promises, billions wasted. They almost killed Buick until the Chinese market intervened. They've consolidated their remaining brands into an indistinguishable mass of crossovers and trucks. A Chevrolet Traverse, Buick Enclave, and Cadillac XT6 are the same vehicle with different grilles. Oldsmobile died so GM could build 3 versions of the same boring crossover. The engineers who fought to save Oldsmobile had a plan. They called it Project Centurion, a complete brand reinvention for Oldsmobile's second century. The lineup would have been stunning. A rear-wheel drive Aurora competing with the BMW 5 Series, a compact sports sedan challenging the BMW 3 Series, a sophisticated crossover predating the luxury crossover boom, a hybrid performance car using GM's electric motor technology from the EV1 program. The business case was solid. Development would cost $3 billion over 5 years, exactly what GM spent killing the brand. Projected sales were 400,000 units annually by 2005, generating approximately $12 billion in revenue with 8% margins. That's nearly $1 billion in annual profit. The plan required patience, vision, and courage. GM's board had none of these qualities. Instead, they chose extinction. They murdered a 107-year-old brand to save money they ended up spending anyway. They destroyed customer loyalty that took a century to build. They scattered engineering talent that could have saved them from bankruptcy. They created a hole in their lineup that still exists today. All because some MBA with a spreadsheet decided Oldsmobile's numbers didn't look right. Let me share some numbers that would make those MBAs weep. A pristine 1970 Oldsmobile 442 W30 now sells for over $200,000. A documented 1949 Rocket 88 can fetch $100,000. Even a nice Aurora, a car GM couldn't give away in 2003, commands $15,000 today. The market is telling GM something they refuse to hear. Oldsmobile mattered. The collector market understands what GM never did. Oldsmobile represented aspiration without arrogance. You could pull up to a country club in a 98 without looking pretentious. You could street race a 442 without looking like a hoodlum. You could drive a Cutlass Supreme to a business meeting and be taken seriously. Oldsmobile occupied a unique social position that no other brand has successfully claimed. Tesla now owns that space. Think about it. Tesla builds technology-focused, premium but not luxury vehicles that make owners feel smart, not snobbish. Sound familiar? That's exactly Oldsmobile's market position. The Model 3 is what an Aurora successor could have been: sophisticated, efficient, innovative, and attainable. Elon Musk is building the company GM killed. The workforce that built Oldsmobiles possessed skills GM will never recover. These weren't just assembly line workers. They were craftsmen who understood why panel gaps mattered, why engine balance was critical, why a door should sound solid when it closes. They took pride in building rockets. When GM killed Oldsmobile, many of these workers took buyouts rather than build Chevrolets. Their knowledge walked out the door. GM's current quality problems trace directly to this loss of institutional knowledge. The company that once built rocket V8s that ran for 300,000 miles now recalls vehicles for engines that fail at 30,000. The company that invented the automatic transmission now sources transmissions from suppliers who don't care about GM's reputation. The company that created the muscle car now builds electric Hummers that weigh 9,000 pounds and cost $100,000. The distributors and suppliers who depended on Oldsmobile got destroyed too. Lansing Wheel Company, which made distinctive Oldsmobile wheels for 30 years, went bankrupt 6 months after the announcement. Dozens of smaller suppliers, companies that made Oldsmobile-specific trim pieces, badges, and components, simply disappeared. These weren't just business relationships, they were partnerships built over generations, destroyed by a press release. Here's something GM's executives never understood. Killing a brand doesn't just eliminate costs. It eliminates revenue streams you didn't even know existed. Oldsmobile owners bought GM parts, used GM dealers for service, and often bought other GM vehicles for their families. When Oldsmobile died, that entire ecosystem collapsed. Those customers didn't just stop buying Oldsmobiles, they stopped buying GM everything. The marketing disaster extended beyond the "not your father's Oldsmobile" debacle. GM spent $150 million annually advertising a brand they were killing. Think about that insanity. They ran Super Bowl commercials for cars that would be orphaned within 18 months. They sponsored NASCAR races with a brand that was already dead. They printed brochures for vehicles that would never see a second generation. It was corporate schizophrenia at its finest. Oldsmobile's racing heritage died too. The brand that dominated early NASCAR, that won the Indianapolis 500 in 1946 and 1947, that powered countless drag racing victories, gone. The Rocket V8 that terrified competitors at Daytona and Darlington, silenced forever. GM kept the Corvette racing program but killed the brand that invented American racing success. Make it make sense. The international implications were significant. Oldsmobile was beginning to export vehicles to China and Europe when GM pulled the plug. The Aurora had generated serious interest from German buyers who wanted American luxury without Cadillac ostentation. The Bravada was perfect for emerging markets that needed sophisticated SUVs. GM killed these opportunities before they could mature. Let's discuss what should have happened. A competent leadership team would have recognized Oldsmobile's potential and invested accordingly. They would have developed a focused product line, maybe 5 models instead of 15. They would have emphasized Oldsmobile's engineering, heritage with innovative powertrains and advanced technology. They would have marketed to younger buyers without alienating existing customers. They would have given the brand time to evolve. Look at what Hyundai did with Genesis. They took a brand nobody respected and transformed it into a legitimate luxury competitor through persistent investment and consistent improvement. That transformation took 15 years and billions of dollars, but now Genesis competes with BMW and Mercedes. GM had a brand with 100-year heritage and killed it rather than invest in its transformation. Hyundai built from nothing what GM destroyed. The environmental angle is particularly galling. Oldsmobile engineers were developing hybrid technology in the late 1990s. They had a mild hybrid system ready for the Aurora that would have improved fuel economy by 25%. They were experimenting with diesel-electric hybrids for the Bravada. They had plans for a pure electric commuter car using GM's EV1 technology. All of it died on December 12, 2000. Meanwhile, Toyota was launching the Prius, Honda was developing the Insight, even Ford was working on hybrid escapes. GM's response? Kill the division that was actually developing green technology and double down on Silverado production. 20 years later, they're scrambling to electrify while Toyota owns the hybrid market. Oldsmobile could have been GM's green brand, instead it's fertilizer. The personal stories are what really hurt. I interviewed a retired assembly line worker named Tom who spent 37 years building Oldsmobiles in Lansing. His father built them for 42 years. His son had just been hired when the closure was announced. 3 generations of his family building rockets. Tom cried during our conversation, not because he lost his job, he found another one. He cried because his life's work was declared worthless by executives who'd never built anything. Another worker, Margaret, ran quality control for Aurora production. She told me about the pride they took in those cars. Every Aurora got extra attention because they knew it represented Oldsmobile's future. They'd check panel gaps with laser precision. They'd listen to engines like cardiologists listening to hearts. They'd test drive every single car before shipping. When GM announced the closure, Margaret said the quality dropped immediately. Why care about perfection when perfection didn't matter? The dealers I spoke with were universally bitter. One dealer in Ohio had just spent $3 million renovating his showroom to GM's exact specifications. He'd been assured by zone managers that Oldsmobile was core to GM's future. 6 months later, he was offered $850,000 to disappear. He sued, won a larger settlement, and used the money to open a Honda dealership. He's sold more Accords in the last decade than he sold Oldsmobiles in 30 years. A California dealer told me about the night of the announcement. He'd heard rumors, but didn't believe them. He had 200 Oldsmobiles on his lot and orders for 50 more. His phone started ringing, customers wanting to know if their warranties would be honored. He didn't have answers. GM didn't provide talking points until 3 days later. By then, he'd lost dozens of sales and would never recover. The enthusiast community remains vibrant despite GM's betrayal. Oldsmobile clubs exist in every state. They organize rallies, maintain registries, and preserve history GM would rather forget. The Oldsmobile Club of America has 6,000 active members, people who refuse to let Ransom Old's legacy die. They're doing what GM should be doing, honoring excellence. These enthusiasts are keeping cars alive that GM wanted dead. They're fabricating parts that GM won't produce. They're documenting history that GM ignores. They're proving every day that Oldsmobile mattered. When you see a perfectly preserved Cutlass at a car show, you're looking at an act of defiance against corporate stupidity. The modification scene embraced Oldsmobile after death in ways GM never permitted during life. LSX swaps into Auroras create 500 horsepower luxury missiles. Turbocharged quad 4s in lightweight Achievas embarrass modern sport compacts. Resto-modded 442s with modern suspension and brakes prove old muscle can learn new tricks. The aftermarket is doing what GM wouldn't, pushing Oldsmobile engineering forward. I need to address Roger Smith, GM's CEO from 1981 to 1990. This man did more damage to Oldsmobile than any external competitor could have. His reorganization schemes, badge engineering mandates, and focus on automation over quality devastated Oldsmobile's identity. He spent $90 billion on robots and acquisitions while starving product development. Oldsmobile needed new engines and platforms. Smith gave them Chevrolet clones and corporate confusion. Smith's legacy was the indistinguishable jelly beans that destroyed GM's brand hierarchy. By 1990, you needed to check the badge to tell an Oldsmobile from a Buick from a Pontiac. They shared everything: platforms, engines, transmissions, interiors, even keys. The only difference was grille texture and marketing nonsense. Customers aren't stupid. They knew they were being sold the same car at different prices. Rick Wagoner, who actually pulled the trigger on Oldsmobile, was Smith's philosophical successor, another finance guy who saw cars as commodities instead of aspirations. He couldn't understand why anyone would pay extra for an Oldsmobile when they could buy the same basic car as a Chevrolet for less. He never grasped that people don't buy transportation, they buy identity. The current GM leadership talks about transformation and revolution, but they're making the same mistakes. They're killing sedans because trucks are more profitable today. They're abandoning affordable vehicles because luxury has higher margins. They're chasing quarterly earnings while competitors build century-long reputations. They learned nothing from Oldsmobile's murder. Here's the most damning statistic. In 2000, when Oldsmobile was killed, GM's market capitalization was $42 billion. Today, after killing Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Saturn, Hummer, and Saab, after bankruptcy and bailouts, after transformation, GM's market cap is $52 billion as adjusted for inflation. They're worth less today than when they had 8 brands. Tesla, which didn't exist when Oldsmobile died, is worth $400 billion. GM killed innovation to protect mediocrity. The Oldsmobile story is really about American manufacturing decline. We used to build things that mattered. We used to take risks on engineering excellence. We used to believe that better was possible. Now we optimize spreadsheets and call it progress. We kill heritage brands and call it efficiency. We abandon innovation and call it focus. Oldsmobile didn't just die. It was murdered by the cowardice that's killing American industry. Every time I see a GM commercial talking about precision or innovation or excellence, I think about that last Alero sitting in a museum. GM had all those things in Oldsmobile. They had 107 years of precision, innovation, and excellence. They threw it away for quarterly earnings that never materialized. They destroyed something irreplaceable to protect something mediocre. The workers who signed that last Alero knew they were signing a death certificate. But they signed it anyway, with pride, because they'd built rockets. They'd built the cars that inspired songs, won races, and defined generations. They'd built dreams with their hands. And on April 29, 2004, they built their last dream and watched it roll away to a museum. GM wants you to forget Oldsmobile. They've scrubbed it from their corporate history. They don't mention it in their heritage marketing. They pretend those 107 years didn't happen. But every time you see a GM product that's indistinguishable from its platform mates, remember Oldsmobile. Every time GM announces another restructuring, remember Oldsmobile. Every time they kill something good to protect something profitable, remember Oldsmobile. Because Oldsmobile's death wasn't just a business decision. It was a betrayal of everyone who ever believed in American automotive excellence. It was a surrender to mediocrity. It was the moment GM stopped trying to be great and settled for being adequate. They didn't just kill a brand, they killed their soul. The Oldsmobile rocket logo, that stylized arrow pointing upward and forward, was perfect. It represented progress, ambition, achievement. GM replaced it with nothing. Because nothing is what you get when you value spreadsheets over spirit, efficiency over excellence, and quarterly earnings over $250,000 loyal customers who believed in building rockets. Ransom Eli Olds died in 1950, having lived to see his company become one of America's most respected automakers. He was spared witnessing its destruction by corporate cowards who understood cost, but not value, price, but not worth, profit, but not purpose. He built cars when cars were magic. GM killed his company when they forgot that they still should be. So the next time you see a surviving Oldsmobile on the road, and they're getting rarer every year, understand what you're witnessing. You're seeing the last remnants of when American automobiles meant something more than transportation. You're seeing engineering excellence that accountants couldn't quantify. You're seeing the ghost of what GM could have been if they'd had the courage to build rockets instead of spreadsheets. The rise and fall of Oldsmobile isn't just automotive history. It's American tragedy. It's the story of how we lost our nerve, abandoned our excellence, and settled for good enough. It's the story of how corporations can murder centuries of achievement for quarterly gains that evaporate like morning mist. It's the story of how building rockets became less important than building PowerPoints. Oldsmobile is dead. The dealers are gone. The factories are demolished or repurposed. The engineers have retired or died. The archives are locked away. But somewhere, in a garage or barn or storage unit, there's a rocket V8 that still fires on all 8 cylinders. There's a Hydra-Matic that still shifts smooth as silk. There's a Cutlass that still makes its owner feel special. There's proof that once upon a time Americans built something magnificent and called it Oldsmobile. What's the rarest Oldsmobile you've ever seen? Have you or your family owned one of these rockets? Share your Oldsmobile stories in the comments. Because even though GM killed the brand, they can't kill the memories. They can't kill the passion. They can't kill the knowledge that once, for 107 years, there was something special called Oldsmobile that built rockets for regular people and changed the world. Until next time, remember, they can kill the company, but they can't kill what it represented. They can silence the rockets, but they can't erase the roar. They can destroy the brand, but they can't destroy what it meant to millions of Americans who believed in engineering excellence. Oldsmobile is dead. Long live the rocket.